All right, here we go. Welcome to Dive into World Building. Today we're talking about memory. I'm afraid that Isabel Yap couldn't make it today. We had a little bit of a scheduling miscommunication. It was probably my fault. But what ends up happening is that we will have her on another time. And so today we're going to talk about memory. And
it's not a no, it's just a not today.
Yep, it's not a no, it's just a not today because her work got busy and all that. So yeah. Well, so I'm gonna put Kimberly on the hotspot because Kimberly was like, I have a ton to say about memory. So why don't you show us what you're thinking about?
Well, one of the things I notice in world building is when, let me rephrase that. One of my favorite things in world building, there are some series out there where characters we've been following for 4, 5, 6 books will remember things and will hearken back to things and characters and people in earlier books.
Yes.
Right. And so that kind of long-term memory is one of my favorite things in a work because it feels like the world is more real, as opposed to a serialized situation where every single book, every single episode is compartmentalized, right? It doesn't have to be like a 15-minute soliloquy on what happened in book 1. They put those at the beginnings. That's the prologue. But those kinds of connections are important if you're trying to build a world that feels like it has existed for a long time.
Yeah.
And I find in organizations, in books, the same kind of thing. I find actually it's rarer to see it done well with orgs than it is to see it done well with individuals, right?
You mean organizations?
Yeah, the lone detective may reference book 1, 2, 3 back when they're on book 7 or 8, but a long-standing military organization that is supposed to have a list of regulations as long as your arm for every single interaction often fails to have that kind of institutional memory across the series.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
And for me anyway, it's jarring when I run across it, and it feels like it's plot sauce, right? It's, the plot tells us we need to do this, so we're going to just pretend this rule, or we're going to create this rule out of the air and plug it in here, which is valid, but it's got to hold true, right, over time. And it's got to feel like it's part of a continuity. And I think that sort of institutional memory fails quite often in world building.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a very specific example of my editor saying, "Hey, Juliet, you need to be better about this in book 2 of The Broken Trust." So fortunately, I did actually address that, but it was the question of the global decline and what had happened after book 1 in the intervening years between book 1 and book 2, and how that would make things like talking about the decline or the relationships between the Grobel and their doctors, how those would be different as a result of the things that had happened in book 1. And those would influence how things played out in book 2. So I was very happy that she pushed me to do that. Right. This is Sheila Gilbert, my editor. She's wonderful. Yay, Sheila Gilbert. But anyway, no, but she's super smart and she made me sit down and think all that through. And it didn't just glue the books together better. It actually helped the characters have more to do. It helped everything seem a little bit more three-dimensional.
Oh, definitely. A series which unfortunately been dropped. But I don't know if I should mention the series directly or the name, because it kind of got dropped and the author's now trying to publish the book 4 on their own. But anyway, book 1 was relatively self-contained in a space station. Book 2 really expanded things. It's a relatively near future space empire. In book 3, they reference things that happened back in book 2. Not only characters remembering, oh, we did this, and this is why we're pissed off at each other, because it was also years back. There's a time jump, just like in your books, Juliet, but also the organizations themselves reacted back to what happened in the second book, because they think, oh God, is this thing in book 2 happening again? And like, what? That was crappy that happened the last time. So actually, it's an example of how it actually works. They actually think about, hey, maybe this is this again, rather than just, as in too many series, like, oh, we run into the same problem again. As you said, plot sauce, like, oh, we're stupid and don't remember things actually happening to a space empire. No, fortunately, sometimes they can get it right. It's like, oh yeah, maybe it's them. Maybe we should prepare.
Yeah.
How refreshing.
Well, I mean,
it's refreshing when someone does it.
I think it's good to do. I mean, it's one of those things that I like to do for backstory purposes, because all of my points of view are really, really tight. And I don't want to step away from that to think about what happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But like, people bring their memories to what's happening to them now, right? Oh, this is like that last time, or I'm having flashbacks. I mean, I don't actually use flashbacks as in the literary technique, which I mean, it's a fully valid technique, just so that's not my choice. But I do have people go, wait, somebody shot at you? God, that's just like 14 years ago. What happened? Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
I remember.
Now I'm going to send this down a bad rabbit hole. Maybe not. One of the most interesting things I find about memory is how it changes and gets reified and sculpted over time. An event happens. You remember it just afterwards as such, but as time goes on, you focus and remember and chip away at some things and remember other things, especially emotional things, more strongly, till the way you remember something 10 years ago is different than the way you remembered it 5 years ago or 1 year ago or 1 day ago, because you kind of sculpted and changed and flensed that memory down. So
yeah.
So some of the extraneous details, like the color of the car that hit me, I don't remember the color of the car. Yep. I remember the feeling, the impact, the shock I had, the look on the driver's face. I don't remember the color of the car anymore. Mm-hmm. I remembered it at the time, but
finding the grapes on the front bumper.
It's just funny how memory and unfortunately, then you can wind up inventing details into things that never actually happened. So memory can be unreliable without you even intending to be, because you're sculpting it mainly along very primitive emotional lines. Memory is a very powerful, primal thing that we can't control quite how we remember things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think also the memory is supported by narrative, mm-hmm. where we take a memory and we turn it into a story. And then we tell that story to help evoke the memory. But then you get into this sort of dialectic between the story that you're telling about the memory and the memory itself. And they cross-pollinate each other. So things from the story could go back into the memory. Right. And you think, yeah, I surely remember that. When a lot of what you're remembering is just sort of some vague images from the memory itself, but also this narrative that you've been supporting over time, which of course, because you've been reiterating it, has probably changed.
Oh, yeah.
And that doesn't just apply to people. It applies to organizations, and it applies to nations. Mm-hmm. Like, history is sort of our narrative of our own national memory.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that definitely changes.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's, the truth of the matter is, in the real world, memory is very fungible, right? Everybody remembers everything differently. And I wonder if it's fair that I expect a higher standard in my literature than, than I observe in my fellow humans. But, working in a big organization, I totally understand how institutional memory gets train wrecked, right? Somebody the keeper of the knowledge gets fired, right? Somebody misses a meeting. That one guy who went to all the trouble of building an entire wiki and then everybody forgot it exists, right? Or they didn't put a sticky note somewhere where everybody can find it. The documentation flurry, I can see how it can happen, but for some reason in fiction, I expect better, right? I expect a cleaner outcome than I think I do from my fellow humans.
Well, it's interesting because we do talk about erasure of history a lot in fiction, and sometimes it's hard to imagine how that erasure happens without, like, I think it's perfectly possible for that kind of erasure to happen without anyone truly intending to erase history. Of course, if you intend to erase history, that's a whole different story. But I think, in fact, that it can happen accidentally because of the lack of a sticky note, as it were. Yeah. Or, some natural disaster happens and your archive of all things falls into the sea. Right?
Yep.
Right.
Oops.
Like consider the Library of Alexandria and how many books are lost because the library was destroyed. And it's just accidents of history, and so we don't have the cultural memory. All that cultural memory is lost.
And then, of course, language changes over time. So we might have recorded memory of certain periods, but it might be in linear A.
No, I do you know about the bear story, about the bear and Indo-European language story? You might know this, Juliet, because you know so much about language.
It's probably, I may have heard it before, but go for it.
Okay, so the word bear in Germanic and other languages represents bear, but we've kind of determined that really wasn't the original word for bear. There's another, from what we can understand from studying language, that there was another word for bear that they didn't use because that would invoke a bear, because that was kind of like, the magical
see.
thinking.
Yeah.
But we don't know what that word was. All we have is the fake word bear that they used instead of the real word for bear. We lost the old word for bear.
It's like 1,000 years later, the bear is only known by he who must not be named.
Exactly.
That's fun. So, yeah. So okay, we're wandering just a little bit, but I think one of the things that you can see, which is fun, I mean, everybody complains about spelling in English, but it's kind of like a memory of what English used to be like, because writing changes more slowly than pronunciation.
Right. We have like 16th century writing and 21st century pronunciation, and it does not match.
And it's like, oh, okay. And unless you go through a process of like deliberately updating, right? Or, either you don't care about whether spelling stays the same and it just follows along where the language leads it.
Or sometimes things do change.
You're like, this written language is really getting a little out of sync with our current usage. We got to update it. Bam.
Like the word Neanderthal in German got changed when German orthography got changed at the end of the 19th century, got more regularized. So the word changed.
Yeah.
But English hasn't done that ever.
No, English will never do that.
No.
English is a sock drawer. It is
a
an
junk
unkept
drawer.
sock drawer. That's right.
It's a junk drawer. Yeah. Except that we're using it all.
except we're using all. But some things get buried in the back. You need, unless you get a writer like the late Gene Wolfe to pull out the word fulgent or some other weird word. They kind of just sit there in the back of the junk drawer.
Usage. For sure.
But they're still there. They're still in the OED. They're still waiting. and sometimes they kind of bubble up to prominence, and English just, well, I'll just steal this word from this language and just keep, adding more stuff to the drawer.
So when we're writing fiction, this becomes a history question, it becomes a language question, it becomes a character question, it operates at all kinds of levels, the question of memory. Right? Do we remember what happened in the last book? Does anybody remember what happened before the last book?
Right.
Kimberly helped me come up with something that is just going to blow everybody's mind at the start of book 3. And it has to do with something that nobody remembers, but which it reappears if you look hard enough for it.
Yeah.
And it has a huge influence on people. Actually, there are at least 2 things that fit that description in book 3. But yeah, some of them on the larger institutional level and some of them on the personal level.
Well, I think, that actually brings to mind the question, when you're writing fiction, when you're world building, how do you invoke a memory without it turning into, exposition time, right? 5 minutes of explaining all the details that people need to understand that memory, right? And that's kind of the tricky part when you're dealing with a timeline that extends before the book, right? By a long period of time. But if you can do it well, that's half the fun, right? It's a bigger story.
The criterion for me is always relevance. If I have a piece of information that I have to put in because I think it's really important for readers to know about it, I try to put it in at the maximally relevant spot. Right. Where it's most helpful to readers, and it's also most helpful to the particular character who we are visiting at the time. Right. So it's not just, you guys need to know that I did all this research before the book started. And more like, so I've got this really dangerous thing I'm trying to do, and it has to be done exactly right. And I swear I've done all the research. It kind of looked like this, but I'm not sure if it's going to work out okay. So there's a sort of current application for the information, and why the character should be remembering it or recalling it, calling it up to consciousness at this particular spot.
Just like human beings. I mean, I don't randomly start trolling my memories. It gets memory works by association. I see something and that sparks something, and that sparks something, suddenly memory. I don't randomly try to remember what I had for breakfast 3 days ago. Once something brings that to mind, like say talking about it right now here. But just as I don't sit there watching a movie and suddenly think about breakfast 3 days ago, unless maybe there's something eating breakfast on the screen. But if they're just doing a regular thing, I'm not going to remember that. It might be there in the brain, but it needs a spark, it needs association. And in a novel, short story, or fictional work, you need plot, element, character to bring that memory to the immediacy.
The nature of memory helps us too. We're more likely to remember something if we've had a specific kind of emotional reaction to it.
Oh yeah,
right.
That's what I was saying before. That like the emotion really charges how we remember a memory.
Well, I mean, like some of our earliest memories can be of things that made us really, really, really happy, or of terrible injuries that we sustained as tiny children. Like that there are things about those memories that make them the ones that stick. Yeah, I mean, one of my characters for book 3 has eidetic memory, and I'm not gonna, that doesn't mean that I'm going to like expound on everything that he remembers at any given moment. It's more like
a long book.
It would, right? It would be a very long book. But I mean, when he needs to recall what happened, he's not going to be struggling with it the way Della and Taggart did in book 2. Like, wait, what did they say? Oh, okay. I'm trying to recreate the context so I can remember what was said. There is that moment in Transgressions of Power, and I worked on it actually quite hard because I was like, okay, can't just sort of have them go, oh yeah, here are all the pieces, and this is super easy for us to remember everything that happened. I wanted to make sure that it was kind of like, what my husband and I do. If we're like, oh wait, so what exactly? Okay, what was it? What did that guy say? Shoot, so that you can get the parts that are important. But my characters don't all have to be like super ultra geniuses for the story to continue forward. Yeah. I think people do a lot with superhero memory, honestly.
I wonder if eidetic memory is portrayed by overuse so much. It's like almost like wishful fulfillment. Because you forget things and that's frustrating. Like, I don't remember that, and that's such a frustrating thing. And it's almost like a wish fulfillment. Like, oh yeah, you want a character that can remember everything, because like there are things about my deepest childhood I wish I could remember. I don't. I just never retained it for whatever reason. And it's like, that's frustrating. Or I'll give you an example. because I even post on Twitter because Norton Juster has just passed away.
Oh yeah.
Phantom Tollbooth. And so back in second grade, it was story time and they read from the Phantom Tollbooth. But I had misremembered and misheard the title of the book. And so for years I thought it was called Milo and the Mathematician. And so when I got to adulthood and I got like this thought, like, oh, maybe I should go find this book because I remember some feeling about it. I couldn't find it because it was also the book as Milo and the Mathematician.
That's not the title.
And I kept racking my brain. What is the name of this book? It can't be that. And then I came across an article and the word mathematician was in there because we talked about the Phantom Tollbooth. Like, that's it. That's the book. Yes, of course, it's the Phantom Tollbooth.
Yeah, right.
It fulminated my brain and I neatly went out and bought it.
And that brings us to another characteristic of memory. The more different things that a memory connects to, the more likely it is to stick around. Not just emotional things, but like if you can sort of nest it within a web of causality or connection, then it's more likely to stick around. That was something that I used to hijack my brain when I was learning things like, scads of vocabulary for a foreign language.
Right.
To say, oh yeah, okay. It was less. I would try very hard to say, okay, now I'm going to use it in a sentence. So I don't just have to remember this word as like a little dollop of language that it just exists like a sparkling diamond all on its own. We will get lost in the depths, right? But to try to put it in context after context to try to see if I could reprocess it and make it your own, right? But at the same time, that's part of how we retain memories is by making them into these narratives or making them our own. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's, when you're writing, people, do this a lot too, right? When you come back to a work after you've set it aside for a few months, right? You kind of go back and you maybe don't read the whole thing, but you'll read specific pieces to like line up your memory of what you've written.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It's not necessarily reading the first 300 pages per se, but you're going to read portions and it will sort of reassemble the plot in your head so that you can sort of continue on forward and it makes sense from where you left off.
Or as a reviewer, if I'm reading a Kindle version of the work, I note take a lot. And so when it comes to the review, I can look through my notes and like, oh yeah, okay, I remember that, okay, I remember I wanted to do that. And I remember the points I wanted to make in the review.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know some people complain about Kindle books and ebooks stuff, but they've made me a better reviewer because I don't like marking up books and messing up physical books. So an ebook, yeah, I could just make notes all day long. So it's like, okay, what did Kimberly say here? What did Juliet say there? And it's there's the note. Okay, that's right. I remember I wanted to talk about the waterfall right there. I made a note about it. Or
Yeah,
the
it's
awkward.
true.
Oh, here's We're Alive.
I know
We're
you
Alive.
have to go, Kimberly.
Bye.
So thank you for getting us kicked off and for
You
being
bet.
here.
I will
Kimberly.
remember next time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now we're a two-hander. Okay.
That's right. No, it's cool though. So the kind of memory that we're talking about, which provides us with backstory and sort of human experience stuff, is a little bit different from whether you can remember what day it is, and whether you need to write yourself a note or have an external brain like an iPhone or someplace
or
where you have
grocery
things,
list. Yeah.
or your to-do list, right? I've got all this
Right.
stuff to do and I can't hold it in my head. So I think it'd be worth talking about working memory, at least a little bit.
Okay.
How many things can you hold in your head at once? Not actually that many.
No, it's I mean, the couple psychology courses I took, yeah, it's a astonishingly small number. I mean, for all
it's
us
like
being
7 or something.
being as an advanced technological civilization, we can hold very little at once in our short-term memory before things start falling out.
I think that people have used different kinds of tools to help their memory since the dawn of time.
You know about memory palaces, of course, right?
Memory
Palaces.
No, tell me about that.
You don't know about memory? Oh, goody. I can tell you and the listeners and the watchers all about memory palaces.
Excellent. I'm ready.
So memory palaces were a technique pioneered in all the classical civilizations, Greece, Rome, China, as a way of trying to organize and store memories by basically associating with objects, scenes, and things inside of a mentally constructed house or building. And so,
oh, interesting. Okay.
And
sort
so
of like a memory technique of visualization.
Right. So you could remember that poem, that story, that event because you've reified it in your brain with a particular object in this memory palace, so that, and of course, as part of the technique, you would go through your memory palace periodically and evoke these things because memory works by association. And if you keep evoking and thinking about it, things come back to mind.
Right.
And
right.
so I learned about this in all things in a book by Jonathan Spence called The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci. Matteo Ricci was a 16th century Jesuit who went to China to preach Christianity, but he got wrapped up in learning about Chinese culture and maps and all sorts of things. And he brought this technique with him as a way to remember everything he saw and did in China.
Wow, that's cool.
But this technique goes back to at least, I mean, we have notes from the ancient Greeks and Romans that they did this sort of thing. So it goes back thousands of years, because before it was prized better than writing things down. It's like having everything in your head. And
yeah.
If you think about it even further, there are other techniques of memory, rhyme, association, repetition.
Right. This poetic meter and rhyme and basically poetic structure are there in part because it helps you remember something longer.
I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey, as examples, start off as epic poems that they would just remember and pass on, and that's what there's techniques and formulas and basic compositions within the Iliad and the Odyssey that make it easier for a poet to remember, because you're using the same sort of epithets and names and things to describe people, and makes it easier to remember this big long thing to go on. It's fascinating that how humans are able to try to hack around the memory problems by basically constructing these sorts of techniques to
absolutely
use it. And
there are a couple of examples that are worth mentioning of people with memory problems or characters with memory problems who have specific techniques that they use to help them with their memory problems. And I'm thinking of course, Dory from Finding Nemo.
Mm-hmm.
And she's got she's got these little rhymes and things that she uses, and she's got the shell pattern thing from Finding Dory. I always thought she was a really interesting character because you can never quite tell when something was going to slip from her short-term memory, where it could be easily lost, into her long-term memory, where it would actually stick around. Yeah. So, and I thought that was a character who could have turned out so badly, but because of the way that they handled it, turned out brilliantly, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could have been very bad, for in terms of representing disability and whatnot. But fortunately, it was done with better.
Well, and she was sweet, and she was not made. I mean, you learned lessons about why it was important to pay attention to her, and not blow her off. And I think also they didn't shy away from showing her pathos, and it was important for her to have long-term relationships, but difficult for her to actually form them, right? And so she, as a character, she engaged me on a lot of different levels. So I thought that was very interesting. And then there was, and I'm not remembering the name of it. It was the film with the Australian actor who tattooed things on his skin because he couldn't remember.
Memento.
There we go. I was like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I know I should remember this name. Yes, absolutely. So that again, memory tools, right?
I mentioned Gene Wolfe before. Gene Wolfe, Soldier of Sidon, Soldier of Eret. He can't form new memories, so he has to write things down.
Yeah.
Because he got cursed by the gods, but the other half of the curse is he can see supernatural things no other people can, but he doesn't always recognize them because he doesn't have the long-term memory. So a couple times he runs into the same god. The god knows he met him before, but he doesn't remember because he doesn't recognize him. So the reader recognizes those things that the character doesn't, which is, again, we talked about that imbalance between character knowledge and reader knowledge, and that
it's a fun thing to play with, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Like, I know something the character doesn't. Well,
I think, to be honest, I kind of enjoy that because that's a kind of a feeling of confidentiality between the author and the reader that you can't have unless you're playing that kind of game.
Yeah, you can't have that in real life. You can only have that between a reader, a writer, and the book. But
I mean, I think that's one of the things that multiple points of view also makes possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because each of the points of view is kind of semi-opaque to the other points of view.
Or like an omniscient point of view, like say Dune, where you're hopping at everybody's head all the time, and you have a point of view nobody else has. Because you're hopping between a scene between people at a banquet, and you're seeing things that other characters just can't because they don't have that 30,000-foot view that you do. It's really hard to do, and not a lot of writers will try it. Not before, not since.
It requires a very strong compass for what kind, like where you go next without losing the reader.
Yeah, and in some of the sequels, well, Mr. Herbert, in my opinion, didn't quite kind of lost his compass, but in the first book, he gets it nailed on.
Yeah,
I thought.
I mean, Dune is an interesting book, and I have many thoughts, but that's not the topic of today's session.
No, but I mean, it does touch on memory because the whole memories, institutional memories of the Bene Gesserit, basically,
absolutely,
and how they seeded seeded things on planets as remembering, oh yes, on this planet we seeded this culture, so in case anyone gets stranded there, we can use that sort of thing. So, and not to mention the whole lack of, think of mentats. Going back to memory,
Yeah,
remember in Dune,
absolutely.
we don't have a lot of computers, although some planets are trying to rebuild them again. So you have to rely on human memory and human thought in order to propagate a culture.
Yeah.
But something is bothering me now. I haven't thought about it consciously till now, and I keep going back to the Fellowship of the Ring and
I was just going there.
Elrond saying, "I remember 3,000 years ago," and I'm thinking, really? How do you remember something from 3,000 years ago? And what is coloring your memory of that event? And how do you keep that in your brain fresh? 3,000 years of memories.
Well,
man.
There's a degree to which we have fantasy hand wavium, right? And we kind of say, the elves have these really long lives. And one of the features of them is that they remember their really long lives after a certain point. But it's still, it is a little bit of a memory superpower, right?
Yeah. It's like remembering 3,000 years of history is, yeah. I've seen some science fiction novels where you have immortals. I'm thinking of Poul Anderson's Board of a Million Years and whatnot, where they explicitly, they tell, oh yes, we can't remember everything. So I've just tried to forget stuff so I can remember new stuff. It's just like,
but I think
as
it's
a way
worth
of getting
pointing
around
out
it.
in the Lord of the Rings, you've got Elrond who remembers what happened 3,000 years ago, but Gandalf, who has also been around for basically that long. I'm
longer.
I think
even
so.
Longer.
I honestly, I will say this for whoever might be watching. I am not an encyclopedia of Lord of the Rings lore.
Neither am I.
Gandalf,
That was my
I know,
friend
has been
Scott.
around for a heck of a long time, but he doesn't remember stuff.
Yeah, it's just not in his brain. It's like
the same way that say
the entrance to Moria is a perfect example. Like he forgot how to get through Moria,
or the road through Moria, or for example, what the One Ring looked like.
Yeah, he should know that. He should know,
right? Like, oh geez, Bilbo's got this ring. I wonder which one it is. I better go look that up.
Yeah,
I'm gonna take this long horse ride.
Oh,
so I can go look that up.
He needed Google. He didn't have it.
Right. Yeah, he needed Google for sure. Well, the internet is a really interesting form of collective memory.
And what gets remembered?
Well, actually, okay, the internet remembers everything.
Yeah.
So the way that things get sort of archived and cataloged and stuff, and if you say something on the internet, that people can dig it up years later.
Or
it is a form of institutional
some
memory.
That stuff gets remembered, and some of it doesn't. I did find cached in archive.org a copy of an ancient website I created from long ago, from the 90s. It's there. It still it got preserved somehow. It's like, that's very random and strange. It warms my heart because I worked hard on that back in the day, but I didn't expect it to the last 25 years. But there it is. But other stuff is kind of lost. Not everything. It's kind of imperfect filter.
Because it's its own form of narrative, right?
Right.
In order for something to be on the internet, somebody has to put it there.
Right, and someone has to save
it. And YouTube has an enormous collection of songs that are from a long time ago, and you're like, whoa, how did all of that get on there? But somebody put those on there, right?
Somebody took memory is an effort. Memory is an active process. I think, except maybe the eidetic people, maybe they just passively remember everything, but or what's the phrase? The phrase waking life, in the movie Waking Life, which is a very strange movie about dreams, one character says to another, but before you wake up, remember, because remembering is a more psychotic activity than forgetting. And I always thought that was a very strange phrase, but it's but memory is an active thing. It's we choose to remember, as like I was saying before about the reifying and the recalling and the honing
Right.
down. I mean, I'm not going to remember 2 weeks from now what I had for dinner tonight because it's not really going to matter. But the fact I got something interesting in the mail today, that I'm going to remember because I'm going to reify and think about it, and it's going to focus again and again because it's much more important. So
Yeah.
memory is a we choose to remember.
Yeah.
I mean,
And I think that we
may not choose
choose to,
actively, but we can choose.
we
I mean,
revisit, we
trauma.
reconstruct, we recall. I mean, I've had a couple of times in my life when I have felt very down, and that wasn't exactly necessarily relevant, but at those times, one of the things that I enjoyed doing was reconstructing my memory of a particular thing. So like I was I was in France and I was lonely. And I was staying with some friends and I was feeling really irritated with them for a period of time. So I was like, I'm going to see if I can remember all the lyrics from the Pirates of Penzance. And the reason that I chose that particular thing was that it was something that that my family and I had listened to on cassette tape during family trips. And it was also something that it was an operetta that I had performed in high school.
Oh.
And so I had a lot of it in my brain. And I just was like, I'm going to go wake this up. All right. And I actually got pretty far, using all of those little things that were built into it. Right. I mean, like all the many times that I had heard it across contexts and all of the rhymes and the poetic things and my memory of the music and all that stuff. It was really interesting that, the more you focus on treading those mental paths, the more you find that they will open up for you, which I find is a really fascinating quality of memory.
And I think that also works for documents and institutions. The more you go into a particular thing to try to find something, the easier it is subsequently. Like the other day, my boss asked me to reconstruct a waterfall chart for something I'd done 2 years ago. I thought I had to think, okay, how did I do this? And so I had to go looking through the folder to find the thing, and I found the chart, and I had to remember, okay, how did I do this chart to get it just this way? And I had to mentally reconstruct and rebuild it for the new thing. It's like I was panicked at first, like, oh, I'm not going to remember this, but I had to reify and look and see, and things started coming back together. Like, oh yeah, this is how this works, and put it together for him. So, which made me happy. That was like, because otherwise I was like, oh God, how am I going to do this? I've been doing this for 2 years, but I did the thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I people talk to me often about, for example, forgetting how to speak another language, right? And yeah, you can forget. But typically what will happen is if you try to relearn it again, it will happen faster because there is something left in there, usually.
But like my high school Spanish.
Yeah. So like my husband, for example, is doing Duolingo French. And he took French for a year in high school. And he's been to France a few times with me. And
right. As I say,
and
yeah,
so
like
the Duolingo French helps him bring up memories of the trips he's taken and also of the French he learned in high school. And it's been an interesting kind of memory experience as well as a study.
Well, yeah, I kind of rekindled a little bit of that Spanish a bit on my 2015 Rome trip, because there I am in Rome. I also rekindled Latin because I don't know Italian, but I know Latin and I know Spanish. So I was trying to figure out figuring out Italian from Latin and Spanish.
Yeah.
And basically recreate my memory of both those languages and kind of hacking my way to learn enough Italian to survive and be able to read
To get
plaques in
along.
museums to get
To
along.
make sure you have food.
Yes, exactly. So that was good. That was a good way to stimulate my memory. It was basically to work it and see it in this new context and the wonder and joy and happiness of being in the Eternal City. I mean, one of those trips of a lifetime. I mean, it's like a dream to
Absolutely.
going around for 30 years. So like here it was, like, yeah.
Well, and jogging your memory can be as simple as reconstructing a piece of context, right? Or, it's like if you ask me how to get to certain friends' houses, I have no idea. I wouldn't be able to explain it to you. But if I start going there, I'll go there just fine. Because the context reconstructs the route in my brain.
And muscle memory and quote muscle memory is really just subconscious memory of how things work, and you're off and running.
Yeah, I think there's also a level of expertise that comes into it with things like muscle memory. Like if you've really grasped the skill of riding a bicycle, for example, and then you don't ride your bicycle for a really long time, your brain still has kind of internalized the relationships between the various movements, like coordinated the various movements in your head. So when you get back on there, you're not having to re-coordinate all those movements. The relationship between them seems to somehow remain. I mean, obviously this isn't true for everyone.
No,
but for a great many people, I think it is true.
I mean, I mean, now to get really topical, what is a vaccine except a way to stimulate your immune system to remember that when the virus shows up, okay, this is how we fight it. It's basically forming that memories.
And okay, so taking that idea a little further, measles is a virus that makes your immune system forget all the other things that it's been exposed to.
Measles is a nasty piece of work.
Oh, measles is nasty stuff. But if you're vaccinated against measles, then it's actually really great, because there's no chance that your institutional memory will get expunged and you'll have to start over.
Right, and measles is just so spreadable and so dangerous because of the way it works in the immune system, that when you get a cluster of anti-vaxxers, you get measles outbreaks. And we're having that in America now in this 21st century. It's like, and it spreads like wildfire.
That if you have a measles outbreak, then other things like mumps and all kinds of other stuff is going to recur, because all of a sudden the measles has erased those
it paves the way
ability to deal with other things. That was one of the most fascinating pieces of history, as far as I was concerned, in terms of when I was reading about the measles vaccine, people vaccinated against measles, and all of a sudden there were so many other types of diseases that stopped when just measles was vaccinated against. And it happened to be because of this property of the measles virus. Fascinating stuff.
So yes, that almost goes back to the whole, we were talking about actively forgetting memories and institutions removing memory, and the measles the measles virus kind of works as a bulldozer to destroy memory. And that makes me think of an active destruction of memory reminds me of the story of Queen Hatshepsut, and her son tried to chisel off of every monument he could find, but there was just so many that he couldn't erase her from the memory of Egypt. There was just too much, thankfully. But he tried his best to erase her from history.
Yeah.
He couldn't quite. Yeah. Or back to Roman, the whole idea of the damnatio memoriae, where you just you just strike someone from history. They're so bad, we're not going to remember you ever existed.
Yeah.
it's a frightening idea. It's like you never were. That's worse than dying. That's just like erasing your entire existence. That's a
Well, and you know what?
terrible thing.
And we're kind of getting to the end of our hour, but the memory is a really important question in the movie Coco.
I haven't
And
seen
it's
Coco,
related
so
to
tell
what
me.
you were just saying, because it's talking about how the idea is that you can continue to live in the land of the dead until no one still remembers you. Right. And it's about preserving memory. And well, anyway, that's a fascinating and very moving movie.
I haven't seen it. I'm gonna have to see it.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, put that on your list.
Hold. I'm writing this down. Must see Coco.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely wash it with tissues.
Uh-oh. Okay, one of those movies. Okay, good to know.
Yeah, trust me. So yeah. And actually the one thing that occurred to me a minute ago, but memory is also used as a constructor of relationships and social connection. Because, for example, of the way that nerds trade quotes, right? Where you inconceivable, or we so many of us that would, you keep using that word and then somebody else will know the rest of the quote, right?
Right.
That kind of stuff is again a memory thing, and it's also a sort of call response pattern, and it's also kind of a secret handshake for members of a particular discourse community. So, and some people use it in pretty dangerous ways to gatekeep and all that kind of stuff. But
yes, yeah, there are darker sides to that. Like, oh, you don't know that quote from The Princess Bride? You're not a real fan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so yeah, there's always that. But I guess we can conclude by saying there's a lot of different aspects of memory that you can bring and think about as you're putting together a story.
Absolutely. It's a rich field, and there's lots of things to try and experiment with.
Yep.
Do it.
All right. Well, so thank you all if you are listening, and I am going to take us off the air. We will meet again next week, and I will get you guys caught up as soon as I can on when we can have it. So yeah, Papa.